In this video, we're going to show you how to install the axle bearing on your Jeep Grand Cherokee located in your rear differential. Using your 19mm socket, go ahead, loosen and remove the lug nuts. With all the lug nuts removed, grab the wheel, remove it, and set it aside. We're going to remove our brake caliper as well as the caliper bracket in one component. We're going to use an 18mm socket. We're going to undo the two bolts for the caliper bracket, one here, one on the bottom. And I'm just going to break this one free, and I'm going to move to the lower one. I want to break this one free. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the lower bolt. The upper bolt will hold the caliper and bracket in place for now. Now in most cases your brake caliper will be pretty firm up against the brake rotor. So once you remove this upper bolt, we'll just use a pry bar, a small pry bar, and work the caliper bracket and caliper off of the rotor. You're just going to use a pry bar, and you're going to go on the top somewhere between the rotor and the pads, break it free, and work this off. Now the other tool you want to have is a hook, hanging tool, something to this effect, because once we remove the caliper, pads, and bracket, we want to go ahead and support this up and out of the way. I'm going to hook this and set it up on the side. Now the purpose here is you want to just make sure that you take as much pressure off of the flex hose down below. Make sure that this is secured. If you have to, run a securing strap around this hook here, someplace else on the chassis to hold it in place, but ours is pretty secure where it's at. Grab your rotor, wiggle that off, and set that aside. On the back side here, right behind our backing plate, there's going to be 4 nuts with studs. There's one here, down below, there's one on the top here, and then there's one on the front side. Now these are 14mm nuts. I'm going to use our socket and ratchet, and let's loosen those. I'm going to break these all free, spin them off a few threads first, and then we'll come on back and start to remove those. We'll just spin that one off there because our socket is stuck on the nut. Now at this point, let's go ahead and remove the other 3 nuts completely. Now depending on your location, if you have excessive rust, you want to go ahead and spray all this stuff down with some rust penetrant. Ours is coming apart pretty easy. And go ahead and set those aside. On the back side right here is our ABS speed sensor. We're going to use an 8mm socket. I'm going to remove the bolt here. Once again, yours might be a little bit rusty. Spray it down with some rust penetrant. And then remove the sensor. Just let that hang. Now at this point here, we're going to pull out our whole entire axle with the flange and the bearing and the seal. We're going to use an axle puller. The axle puller is also known as a slide hammer. And let's go ahead and work this out. Go ahead and remove our tool. Now, because we separate our axle from the differential itself, you're going to lose a little bit of differential oil. So we're just going to put a catch bucket or some towels underneath to catch the fluid as we remove this. Now we're going to slide this out. And remove the axle. Now what you do want to do is protect your e-brakes from getting saturated in rear gear oil here. So just separate that like that. Put that aside. Using our slide hammer with the claws, we're going to go ahead and pull out our bearing race. Here's the bearing race itself. Now in order to go ahead and replace this bearing here, we're going to have to remove the collar here. This is pressed on. We're going to have to cut this. We're going to cut this, and we're going to remove this, the bearing, the seal, and then we're going to go ahead and use our press to press on all three new components. Now, using eye protection and your air tools, we're going to go ahead and cut this locking collar as well as into the bearing. We want to go ahead and split these and pull these off. Be careful not to gouge the axle itself where these components are going to be sitting in. So what we're going to do is split and then try and chisel these components off and save the axle. Now you're going to get to a point where you can probably use a chisel to go ahead and split this. Now at this point here, I want to go ahead and remove our bearing as well. We're going to continue this process of cutting the bearing itself. Same process we were doing for the locking collar here. So you pull the cage off and the bearings, and I continue to try and work this collar off. I'm going to go ahead and remove our component here. Now when we removed our seal, you want to pay attention. The seal itself is facing towards the axle hub itself. Make sure that goes on the same way. Now after we cut everything off, you can see that our cuts are at an angle right to left. And on our bolt-on plate here, there's a notch in it. Well, somebody was already in here prior, used a large cutoff wheel and cut into this here. Now it's not critical, it's not going to cause a failure of the component. However, you want to try and prevent that from happening. The other way that we know that someone else has been in here is that there are cuts in our axle shaft that are going the opposite way that we had cut. So we know someone had been in here. Now, if you want to, it's a good time to replace this axle shaft. It's not critical. However, it is a wise thing to go ahead and do. Now, we're going to keep this axle shaft just for this video. And we're going to make sure that there's no burrs or anything causing any restriction from keeping our bearing from being pressed on, as well as our locking collar. So let's go ahead and grab our new components and bring this over to the press. Now at this point, we have our locking collar on the bottom, our tapered bearing facing cone down because that's what's going to go into the axle. We have our seal facing up because that's what's going to seal the backside of this flange into our hub itself. So I'm going to go ahead and slowly start to press this up and on. Now at this point here, you want to make sure that the bearing is seated as well as that locking collar. And you're going to feel the press pretty much bottom out. It's not going to want to go anymore. And yes, this is going to be free floating, but this is what is going to be securing the bearing and the axle itself into our axle. So once that is bottomed out, you can see that the locking collar is fully seated on our axle down here. We now go ahead and release this. Now on your axle tube, you want to go ahead and make sure that it's clean of any defects, any burrs, anything like that. We're going to use a shop rag. Go ahead and wipe this out. We're going to do an inspection. Run your finger on the inside, see if there's any rust, any types of gouges, anything like that. You just want to be careful of that in case someone else has been in here already. Ours looks pretty clean. It is wiped out and we're ready to install the new bearing race. Now the new bearing race is a tapered one here. You want to make sure that it's tapered from the outside going in. We're going to line that up. We're just going to gently kind of tap that in. You can see that kind of setting in nice like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the old bearing race, press it up against the outside of it here, and we're just going to work that to assist us to getting that tapped in and seated inside. Now you'll be able to hear it. Here it is. You'll know that that is fully seated. Then we'll go ahead and work this out. I'm just going to use our pliers to go ahead and wobble that out like so. Now you can look on the inside and you can see that the bearing race is fully seated inside the axle tube. Let's now go ahead and install our backing plate and then our axle. Then you wipe down the flange. Make sure that you don't have any rust built up on the outside on the perimeter here. This is where the backing plate is going to sit as well as the axle hub face that's going to fit in here. Now if you have rust built up, use a wire brush, bristle brush, or whatever you need to go ahead and clean this. If you do that, make sure you take a rag, stuff it in the axle tube. You don't want debris getting inside that. Ours is pretty clean. We can go ahead and bring up our backing plate here, line that up. That looks beautiful. Let's go ahead and grab our axle and set that into place. Inspect the axle splines. Make sure there's no damage to these here. You can go ahead and give them a quick wipe down. Go ahead and line this up. We're going to slide this down inside the axle, inside the tube itself. Now, you're going to feel it. It might bump into something. You don't want to shove it in. You basically need to lift up the axle shaft and fit it inside the inner bearing that is inside the middle of the differential area. So you want to tip that up, slowly feel around with that, and there it goes, it's sliding into place. Now line up your flange. Line that up inside. Our axle is in, our flange is in, the bolts are coming through the back side. Now let's go ahead and install the nuts on the back side of the flange. And at this point, we can go ahead and install the nuts. We're going to get all four of these started by hand first. Once we get all these started, we're going to go ahead and use our wrench and we'll snug those down. With all the nuts started, let's go ahead and snug these down. And what this is going to do is pull that flange in and seat that seal that is on the inside. Now I'm going to go from the top to the bottom, or we're going to go from the bottom to the top. I'm going to tighten that down a little bit. Then I'm going to come to this rearward nut here and we'll snug that one a little bit, and then we'll go to the front one. So what I'm doing is I'm crisscrossing to go ahead and bring that seal in nice and evenly. And we'll come back to that first one again. We're going to continue to do this consistently back and forth. So that's pretty snug there. It's pretty bottomed out. Let's go ahead and go up to the top one. We'll snug that one down. With that one snug, hit the back one, and then we'll finish up with that forward nut. Once we have all four of these nice and snug, we're going to follow up with a torque specification for all 4 units. Let's torque down these nuts to 45 foot-pounds. Now we do not have to have a certain pattern on this. We snugged it down nice and even all the way around. Install the ABS sensor into the flange port here. Now this bolt basically just has to get snugged into place. It doesn't have to be super tight. The bolt just bottomed out, a little bit more. Now we removed our axle from the axle tube or differential itself. We had lost a little bit of differential oil. Now you want to come on over here to the center differential cover, and there's a rubber plug right here. What you want to do is go ahead and grab a tool, a pry tool, and remove this rubber plug like so. Now inside here is where the oil fill is, and what you want to do is put your finger in and just touch down. Just push your fingertip down. If you can touch oil, well, you're filled. If you're not touching any oil, the differential is low on oil, and we're not touching any oil. It should pretty much be level with the bottom of this hole here. So let's go ahead and top this off using the appropriate gear oil recommended by the manufacturer. You want to go ahead and start filling this till you just start to see the fluid dribble out. There it is. Now we do have a rag underneath to catch any residual fluid coming out. Go ahead and give that a wipe. And then reinstall the plug. Now this simply just presses into place. Give that another wipe. And your fluid level is all set. Go ahead and line up the brake rotor. Work that on. Now I'm going to go ahead and thread on one of the lug nuts. This is going to keep the rotor nice and stable while we go ahead and put the caliper and bracket back on. Remove the supporting hook, set that aside, and we're going to slide our caliper back on here. Now that we have the caliper and bracket mounted in its general location, we want to go ahead and install the 2 bolts on the back side. Go ahead and line up that bolt and just position that, wiggle that caliper bracket around. We're just going to get that started a few threads. And we'll go ahead and get that lower bolt installed. Going to do the same here. Once you have that started, we're going to go ahead and put our ratchet and socket on there and snug those down. Once you have those snug, don't forget to go ahead and remove that securing hook. Remove that from the vehicle, set that aside. Now the torque specification for these caliper bracket bolts is 66 up to 85 foot-pounds. We're going to go to 75 on these here. Remove your lug nut. Once you've torqued these bolts down, you want to go ahead and hop into the vehicle, pump up the brakes because we had the caliper off. Want to make sure that we can get these brake pads fully seated. At that point there, install your wheel. Take the wheel, line it up with these studs. With the wheel in place, we can now go ahead, start all of our lug nuts in place. Once we have all these started, we're going to go ahead and snug them down. Torque the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.